Picture one of the most celebrated men in colonial Virginia. He owns vast estates. He is admired, respected, powerful, and he is quietly, deeply in debt to merchants in London he has never met. He grows tobacco, ships it across the ocean, and the profits vanish into the pockets of British creditors before the money ever reaches his hands. He owes more each year than he can pay. He cannot legally escape it. And that man, and hundreds like him, would go on to lead a revolution. You were taught that the American Revolution was about freedom, about liberty and taxation without representation, and noble ideals of self-government. And those ideas were real, and they mattered. But underneath the soaring language of liberty ran a current that most histories rush past. Money, debt, trade, land. And when you follow that current, the true origin of the American Revolution looks far more complicated and far more human than the story of pure principle we were handed in school. Because the men who led the revolution were not only idealists, many of them were among the most financially entangled, financially motivated actors in the entire Atlantic world. Let us start with that debt, because it sat at the very heart of the southern colonies. The great planters of Virginia, men like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, lived in a strange trap. They grew tobacco, and they sold it through a system that bound them to merchants in Britain. Those British merchants sold the crop, supplied the planters with manufactured goods, and extended them credit. And over time, that credit hardened into deep generational debt. The planters owed enormous sums to their London creditors, debts that passed down through families, that grew with each passing year, and that the planters found nearly impossible to escape. Thomas Jefferson himself was buried in debt for much of his life, and the structure of that debt was so binding that it shaped the choices available to him at every turn. This was not simply the result of personal extravagance, though there was plenty of that. It was structural. The entire tobacco economy was designed in a way that kept the planters perpetually indebted to British merchants, perpetually dependent, and perpetually resentful. And here is the crucial point. These indebted planters came to see their British creditors not as business partners, but as a kind of chain around their necks. To men steeped in the language of liberty, being permanently in debt to distant British merchants started to feel like a form of bondage, an economic dependency that made a mockery of their pride and their independence. The historian Woody Holton and others have argued that this deep planter indebtedness was a powerful, if often unspoken, motive pushing the Virginia elite toward a break with Britain. Independence from Britain could mean, among other things, a chance to escape or renegotiate the grip of British creditors. Now, the second great financial grievance was about something every colonist understood: the money itself, or rather, the lack of it. The colonies had a chronic shortage of hard currency, of actual gold and silver coin. So to conduct everyday business, many colonies had begun printing their own paper money, their own local currency, which helped grease the wheels of trade and gave debtors and small farmers a usable medium of exchange. But this colonial paper money threatened the interests of British merchants, who feared being paid back in currency they saw as unstable or inflated. And so, in 1764, the British Parliament passed the Currency Act. This law severely restricted the ability of the colonies to issue their own paper money. In effect, it strangled the colonial money supply, forcing commerce to be conducted in scarce British sterling that was always in short supply. Think about what that did to ordinary economic life. Suddenly, money became even scarcer. Credit tightened. Debtors found it harder to pay what they owed. Trade grew more difficult. The Currency Act hit the colonial economy hard, and it hit it broadly, from the great planters down to small farmers and tradesmen. It created a widespread sense that Britain was deliberately squeezing colonial prosperity to serve the interests of British creditors and merchants. Benjamin Franklin himself spent years arguing on behalf of the colonies for the right to control their own currency, understanding just how vital it was to their economic health. The fight over who controlled the money was not a side issue. It was central to the growing anger. And then there was the land. The vast, tempting western land. This is one of the most overlooked financial engines of the entire Revolution. Before the Revolution, ambitious colonists, including a young George Washington, had their eyes fixed on the enormous territories to the west, beyond the Appalachian Mountains. This was seen as a fortune waiting to be claimed. Speculators surveyed it, claimed it, and dreamed of the immense wealth to be made by acquiring western land cheaply and selling it to the flood of settlers moving inland. George Washington was deeply involved in exactly this kind of land speculation, acquiring claims to western acreage that he expected would one day make him and others extraordinarily rich. But in 1763, the British government issued the Proclamation Line. This drew a boundary along the Appalachian Mountains and forbade colonial settlement west of it, largely to avoid costly conflict with Native American nations and to keep the frontier stable and manageable for the Crown. And for the colonial land speculators, this was a financial disaster. Land they had already surveyed, claimed, or hoped to profit from was suddenly placed off limits by royal decree. The immense fortunes they had imagined were blocked by a line on a map drawn in London. Men like Washington saw a path to enormous wealth cut off, not by any natural obstacle, but by British policy. And so, for the colonial elite with Western ambitions, breaking free of British control also meant breaking free of the Proclamation Line and unlocking the vast wealth of the Western lands. Independence had a very concrete financial payoff written into the map itself. Now move north to Boston, and you find a different kind of financial motive, but an equally powerful one. Smuggling. In the port cities of the North, especially Boston, many of the wealthiest and most influential merchants made their fortunes partly through smuggling, through trade that evaded British customs duties and trade regulations. The British Empire had a whole system of laws designed to control colonial trade and force it to benefit Britain. And enterprising colonial merchants routinely got around these laws, smuggling goods to avoid the taxes and restrictions, and growing rich in the process. One of the most famous of these merchants was John Hancock, whose signature would later blaze across the Declaration of Independence. Hancock ran an extensive shipping operation out of Boston, and a significant part of that business involved evading British customs. He was, in plain terms, one of the great smuggling magnates of the colonies. And when the British government, desperate for revenue after its expensive wars, began cracking down on smuggling, tightening customs enforcement, and seizing ships, it struck directly at the fortunes of men like Hancock. That customs crackdown turned some of the richest and most powerful merchants in the colonies into fierce enemies of British authority. When a British customs action led to the seizure of one of Hancock's ships, it helped ignite fury in Boston. These wealthy smuggling interests had every financial reason to fund and support colonial resistance, because British enforcement was a direct threat to their business empires. The organized resistance movement, the Sons of Liberty, drew significant support and funding from exactly these kinds of merchant fortunes built in part on evading the very British rules they now rose up against. And this brings us to the single most misunderstood event of the entire revolution: the Boston Tea Party and the Tea Act that provoked it. We are taught that the Boston Tea Party was a protest against a tax increase on tea. But the reality is stranger, and it reveals the financial machinery underneath the whole conflict. The Tea Act of 1773 was not primarily a tax increase at all. It was, in effect, a corporate bailout. The British East India Company, one of the largest and most powerful corporations in the world, was in serious financial trouble, sitting on enormous unsold stockpiles of tea and teetering toward collapse. The Tea Act was designed to rescue it. The law gave the East India Company special privileges, allowing it to ship its tea directly to the colonies and sell it more cheaply, undercutting everyone else. In fact, the act could actually make legally imported tea cheaper for the colonial consumer. So why would cheaper tea provoke a revolt? Because of who it destroyed. By giving the East India Company this favored, monopolistic position, the Tea Act threatened to wipe out colonial merchants, including all those who dealt in smuggled Dutch tea, and independent traders who could not compete with a subsidized corporate giant. It was a direct assault on colonial businessmen. A single, politically connected megacorporation was being handed the American tea market at the expense of local merchants. Seen this way, the Boston Tea Party was not a tax revolt by frugal consumers. It was, in significant part, a furious reaction by colonial merchant interests against a corporate monopoly that threatened to crush them, dressed in the language of liberty and resistance to tyranny. When colonists dumped that tea into Boston Harbor, they were destroying the property of a corporation that was trying to monopolize their market with the help of the British state. So now step back and look at the full financial picture that had assembled by the 1770s. Southern planters drowning in hereditary debt to British creditors, who saw independence as a way to loosen those chains. Colonists across the board squeezed by the Currency Act, which strangled their money supply to protect British merchants. Land speculators like Washington, blocked from Western fortunes by the Proclamation Line. Wealthy northern merchants like Hancock, whose smuggling empires were threatened by British customs enforcement. And colonial traders enraged by the Tea Act, a corporate bailout that handed their market to a favored monopoly. Every one of these was a powerful financial grievance, and every one of them pushed a wealthy, influential group of colonists toward the same conclusion. That British control had become a threat to their prosperity, and that independence made not just moral sense, but financial sense. Now, honesty demands real care here, because it would be a serious mistake to conclude that the American Revolution was nothing but a money grab by greedy elites. That is not what the evidence supports, and it is not what this story claims. The ideals were real. The arguments about representation, consent, rights, and self-government were genuine, deeply held, and world-changing. Millions of ordinary colonists who had no smuggling empires or Western land claims still embraced the cause of liberty, and fought and suffered for it. The principles of the Revolution went on to inspire movements for freedom around the globe, and their power cannot be reduced to a balance sheet. What the financial lens reveals is not that the ideals were fake, but that they did not float free of self-interest. The men who articulated the loftiest principles of liberty were often the same men whose fortunes were most directly threatened by British policy. Principle and profit pointed in the same direction, and that is exactly what makes it so human. People are most passionate, most eloquent, most willing to risk everything when their deepest values and their material interests align. The genius and the complexity of the founding generation is that, for many of them, the fight for liberty and the fight for their own financial survival had become the same fight. This is the part the official story tends to leave out. When the winners wrote the history, they emphasized the noble ideals and quietly set aside the debts, the land schemes, and the smuggling ledgers. It made for a cleaner, more inspiring founding myth. But the fuller truth, that independence was simultaneously a matter of high principle and the most strategically rational financial decision the colonial elite could make, is not a story of hypocrisy. It is a story of how real historical change actually happens, driven by ideas and interests together, tangled so tightly that even the people living through it could not always tell them apart. And understanding that does not diminish the revolution. It makes it real. Which leaves a question genuinely worth thinking about, and I want to know where you land on it. Of all these hidden financial forces, which one surprised you most? The crushing hereditary debts of the planters, the land speculation blocked by the Proclamation Line, or the smuggling empires threatened by British customs? Tell me in the comments what you think, because the answer says a lot about how much of history is driven by ideals, and how much by the ledger. And if this pulled apart a story you thought you understood, if you want more history where the real cause is hidden beneath the one everyone repeats, then subscribe and stay with us. Because the next story we are opening up is another moment where the world was told one thing, while the truth sat buried in the ledgers the entire time. You will not want to miss it.